So I'm not a historian or a student of translation, but this strikes me as a really, really cool project and things people should be looking at. And I guess two thoughts or questions. One, which this can kind of give us insight about original public meaning, original understanding, to English speakers, and then with respect to non-English speakers. So, with respect to English speakers at the time, I'm wondering how many of these translations are actually out there, because you've got a Dutch guy who's self-proclaimed not a particularly good English speaker and not a lawyer. So how do we know if a slight variation between what he's saying and what other English sources are saying is a subtlety or nuance in meaning, as opposed to kind of a misfire or something kind of off? How do we know? How do we tell the difference between nuance and error if there's kind of a gap? But you could, I guess, and this would contrast, I think, maybe with the EU translations that Lawrence Solan does, because there you have probably fluently bilingual lawyers kind of doing these things. That said, if there's a whole bunch of these things out there, if there's a number of them out there, they're excellent data points, and we can kind of build them up. Anyway, there's definitely still worth studying. So that's my first question. Secondly, and this kind of occurred to me when you were talking, is imagine if there is a gap, right? So imagine that the Dutch guy gets it wrong, or the German guy gets it wrong, and a third of people in Pennsylvania are reading this, right? Could a third of the ratifiers, if to the extent we're kind of understanding that the people who vote for the ratifiers, they're reading a different constitution than everybody else. What are the implications for that in terms of people who are interested in original public meaning? Maybe it's a paper for someone else to write, but what if there is a misfire? What does that do with the kind of original public meaning issues?
So this is closely related to what Jeff first said. So I think the project is spectacularly well conceived, and you're to be complimented not only on that, but also the wonderful, let's call it, honesty about some of the flaws in not in what you've done, but in the translation. So then, but it may be important, I think, to separate the conceptual issue. Can we learn from translations, as to which you have persuaded me, from the epistemic issue? How much can we learn from these translations? How much can we learn from two translations by non-fluent, non-lawyers, at least one of whom, based on your paper, may have axes to grind? One possibility is that you might say, yes, this is the kind of thing we ought to be looking at. It's too bad this doesn't tell us very much. And at least that's my nagging worry. I might note, I agree with Jeff, the more of and with you have two and not one, the more we have, the more we may learn. I suspect that the French translation, which we know did exist at the time, might have been done by by someone more, possibly a lawyer, I have no idea, but more likely a lawyer, just in the sense that French was the language of lots of educated people at the time, and there would have been a greater likelihood that the French translation would have been done by a better English speaker. So maybe the triangulation that we could get from French, I don't know whether there were any others, would give us a little bit more confidence.
I think my comments or questions line up very closely with what was just said. Sort of on this point, whether the translations that we have here are revealing of latent ambiguity or just revealing of bad translation, it would be really interesting. I wonder if there's any evidence out there of any bilingual people having read these translations. I was wondering, are there any of the framers who are fluent enough in German or Dutch to have criticized this endeavor? I'm not sure any of the delegates to the Philadelphia Convention spoke either language, but I do know that Hugh Williamson used to live in the Netherlands, so perhaps he must have picked up some Dutch there. And then you think about delegates to the ratification conventions in Pennsylvania and New York. I know that many New Yorkers in the areas around New York City and Albany, even the English speakers, were fluent in Dutch. For instance, General Philip Schuyler, Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law, was an active campaigner in the ratification on behalf of the Constitution. I know he was fluent in Dutch. It would be fascinating to know whether any of these people ever came across and read these translations. And then it would be tremendously interesting and helpful if any of them ever engaged with the translation, either endorsed them, bickered with them, or read but failed to comment on them, which would tell us something as well. So that's my comment.
Yeah. So, trying to go in order. Jeff, there's a couple questions you asked. One is, is this relevant if no one read them? And to the extent that we're looking at this as the original public meaning as evidenced by what the translators believed the English document said, it doesn't actually matter if anyone read them. One historical source from, I think, the 1800s, off the top of my head, credits Durand's translation as really fueling some of the Federalist sentiment in New York. I'm not sure how much that is actually true, given that the Federalists did not necessarily do that well, but they did do reasonably well in the counties that had a large Dutch-speaking population. Does it matter the difference between nuance and error here? I'm not entirely sure that they can be wrong if we're looking at, aside from when the sentence doesn't grammatically make sense, but if it's a plausible interpretation of a word, it seems that is what at least some members of the public believed it meant, at least to some level of detail. It's not going to be a perfect explanation of what was inside their heads, but I'm not sure that they can be wrong from the perspective of what did the original public believe. The question of what happens if a third of the population of Pennsylvania read the German version and believed something that was not in the English version, I think is a fascinating political theory question that I was afraid to tackle in this because I was afraid it would seem too kind of crazy pie in the sky to start saying that our law is actually this German document. But if we believe that what created the government was the voters saying this is what I believe we should be doing, I think there's a non-insane argument that if a substantial portion of people had read one of the translations and that's why they voted yes or no, that is the government in some sense. But I don't think anyone would ever get anywhere by trying to argue that in reality. So I'll continue to leave it as I did drop it in a footnote though, to be honest. What can we learn from these translations? I think there's two answers to that. You're right that they give a fairly, I think they're one drop in a larger in the larger question of public meaning, right? So you look at the translations and you look at the Federalist Papers and you look at some speeches and you look at the history of what the authors of it said, and it's one more data point, and in that sense, it's not going to be definitive or really change the answer that much. But I do think there's a larger interesting point about how the public might have understood terms of art or been more willing to form judgments about it. That is something worth grappling with, even if we do not take what those particular judgments were as having a real significance. And Thomas, the chair of the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention did study several years in Germany. And I believe, though my memory may be failing me, that he was also a member of the Pennsylvania legislature. So it does, they were not necessarily perfectly fluent backwards and forwards in English and German or Dutch respectively, but they were competent. Durand did write books in English that, read like books. They're in English. They're legible. The German translation, assuming the author's native language was at least probably English, the German is quite good grammatically, and even in cases where my co-author says people that come to it late in life or as a second language often struggle. Like very, very complex pieces of grammar he gets right, except when he just totally botches it and who knows what was happening there. So I think it's a mistake to discount them as being completely incompetent, though there's certainly room for error because they were rushed or imperfect.
Right, we've got a burgeoning queue now. The next trio is Randy Barnett. Oh, did you want to jump in and here?
Oh, no, I have things to do. It'll come up again in the questions.
Okay. Randy Barnett, Richard Ray, and then Larry Solomon.
I just had a very small question that you partially answered in response to Fred, but before I do that, I think you're right to, I just want to reaffirm, I think you're right to say, as you say in the paper, that really we should not be too distracted by how many people read this and what they thought of it. It matters what these two people thought of it, as they're two important data points at what the read meaning of the text was. I rely in the Ninth Amendment debate very heavily, among other things, on Roger Sherman's draft of a Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment of which refers to the natural rights retained by the people to show that rights retained by the people was thought, at least by Sherman, to refer to natural rights. Now, that was a hidden document. It's found amongst Madison's papers, so far as we know, never circulated outside the committee itself. Nobody read it besides other members of the committee. But I still think it's useful evidence about what the public meaning of rights retained by the people was, and that's what you're presenting as well. So I think your answer, I think, was just exactly the right one. It might have a broader significance, but at a minimum, that's an important significance. My question really goes more, it's like in the spirit of Fred's question, and that is, but I would just ask you to say more about, when doing this kind of work, because this is like a path-breaking kind of work that I've never thought about doing before, and now you've opened this up, what kind of authors, what kind of translators are we looking for? I mean, we're going to vet the translators. If we're going to vet the translators in evaluating what they're doing, what are we looking for? I have no idea. What qualities do we want them to have? Good English proficiency, good German and Dutch proficiency, good legal proficiency. How would we go about rating? I mean, Fred postulates that the French translators will be better, maybe, and that these guys. So have you thought of not a formal metric, but some kind of qualitative judgment about how we assess, and whether it matters how we assess, the translators who are engaged in these projects?
So I'll throw in my 2 cents on the question of what the weight of this, and not just the weight, but the type of weight that this kind of remarkable evidence can have for originalist interpretation. So I agree with Randy and everyone else that your position that at a minimum it sheds light on what these two presumably not entirely foolish people thought about the Constitution. That's the minimum, but maybe that's a pretty low minimum for the reasons people said. It strikes me that a lot of the power of this comes from what Jeff said and what you said, that a lot of people seem to have read this. And if it were a supermajority of people who had access only to this document, then you might start to wonder either it should be authoritative, or if it shouldn't, then maybe the government is illegitimate in some sense, or maybe and those are very different options. All right, but those are both possibilities. But so then you might think, well, if you're going to take this democratic approach, what are the options? Well, one might be within each jurisdiction, the majority exposure controls. Another might be you kind of weight them. If you have 60% see one version, 40% see another. This is all going to get to a place, by the way, that you might actually want to mention something about what I'm saying in your piece. I'm just going to go way out first. It could be like you weight it 60-40 or 60-40, right? And it kind of you balance these different values. But another possibility is that this is a qualitatively different type of evidence, because translations, though in some very powerful theoretical sense are commentaries, they might be commentaries perhaps that there is a norm regarding them that is unique. So it might be that when I see a translation from someone who's, I'm a German speaker, this is a German translation, I kind of heard of this guy, I might say, I understand that this is one level removed from if I were an English speaker looking at the actual texts that are being put up for ratification. And if there were such a pre-existing norm, then it might be that when I vote, or if I express enthusiasm or in any way support that translation, I kind of accept, I'm supporting this or something roughly like it. In which case, I've kind of delegated to people who are actually native English speakers and to the native drafters of that document a kind of a linguistic primacy over the ultimate result, in which case my different interpretation might be worth nothing. And the reason I bring that up in part is because, I think you mentioned the idea that you have treaty translations. Frequently they'll be in multiple languages. And my understanding as someone who's absolutely not a practitioner in that area, so maybe I'm totally wrong, my understanding is that there are fairly well-developed conventions for how we understand those kinds of translations and their interrelationship. And this may be a situation where the notion of democratic authority being ascribed to the translation is dependent upon a pre-existing norm or the lack of such a norm regarding the authoritative or non-authoritative status of the translation. In which case, this is actually a unique situation, and this is why I think it might actually be relevant to what you might write in the paper. When you talk about translations and the theory of translations, this might be a way that actually translations are not just any other commentary. They might be qualitatively distinct.
So I'm sort of interested, I mean, there's so many interesting things about this paper, but one thing that's really interesting is how the translators deal with what might be phrases of art, terms of art, right? Just two of the examples in the paper. One is the privileges or immunities clause of Article 4, and in both cases, the interpreters choose a word to translate privilege that seems very similar to the English word, but when it comes to immunity, both the German and the Dutch choose a word that, at least in contemporary English, doesn't seem like it's an equivalent to immunity, right? These are words that basically mean freedom or liberty, right? That's quite different than we think of as immunity, right? It would be interesting to go back and compare that to contemporary usage. And then also, was this a phrase of art, right, at the time, in which case the translation might be quite a ways off. Another example of this, just adjacent section of the paper, is the natural-born citizenship clause, where it looks like the very interesting clause, right, because it looks like the constitutional language is paralleling something that was a phrase of art in British legal usage, the idea of a natural-born subject, right, which had a technical meaning by the time the Constitution was adopted. But of course, they substitute the word citizen for subject for obvious reasons. There are no more subjects, we're now citizens. Does that change the meaning? No one knows. And then these issues come up in the translations, right, where the German and the Dutch, there's no exact equivalent of the American conception of citizen, and the natural part drops out entirely in the German, and then it's ingeboren in the Dutch, and there's no, I don't know if you tried to find this out, but I assume that this is not a technical legal concept in Dutch at the time. Anyway, this is just an invitation for you to comment on the problem of translation when legal terminology is being used. And then this would be a big meta problem if one adopted a theory of constitutional interpretation by which all of the language of the Constitution actually turns out to be technical language, which some people might have such a theory.
Yeah, maybe I'll go in reverse this time. Right, so with natural, it seems like we never knew what it meant, and neither did they, in some sense, because the translators struggle with it and eventually leave it out, thinking that they've somehow captured it in the words that they use for citizen. In the Dutch case, interestingly enough, there isn't one word for citizen, but there is one for a naturalized citizen and one for a citizen at birth, and he just uses the citizen at birth in there. In terms of how we should understand, how we should understand terms of art, I think the descriptively correct thing is that, assuming that these are terms of art, that people reading them probably did form some kind of belief about them, which was probably not in line with the correct version or what the term of art would mean. And then the next question is, so what should we do about that? And I'm gonna leave that off the table for the moment because I've tried to keep the paper fairly descriptive. Richard, this is possibly not satisfying, but to continue going down the the crazy train of are these translations the law? When I talked about this paper to several international law professors when I was at the University of Georgia, they said, listen, if you ask any international law professor about what the Constitution is, they're going to say it's a treaty among states. And so what really the law is, what the Constitution really is what powers the states gave up. And so when you want, maybe not the Dutch translation, because that was by a private committee, but the German translation was rendered by the Pennsylvania government, and in some sense has their stamp of approval as this being the law. And they don't say it in the same way the Europeans do, that these are equal translations, but if the government was created by Pennsylvania ceding some kind of power, that in some sense there is some non-insane claim that the German translation speaks to what Pennsylvania ceded. But maybe that's crazy. Randy, what qualities are we looking for in translators? I would say it's competence to get a useful insight into their understanding. Enough competence with the language that we can draw some good inferences about what they were actually thinking. And it's going to vary. We'll have better and worse ones. But I think that's what we're really going for, because what we're really looking for is what they thought and what people would have gotten from reading.
Here I wanted to say one thing, and just to follow up on the point that Larry Solomon was making. So one plausible theory of technical language in a constitution like the United States based on popular sovereignty is that when the ordinary reader stumbles across a phrase that looks to them like legalese, they could be imagined to have delegated well, this is obviously a fancy legal term, so whatever the lawyers think this legal term means, then that's what it means. So that would be a plausible account of the relationship. But here's the problem. That theory of delegation presumes that the reader recognizes that the thing they're stumbling over is legalese. If they don't recognize it, that it's legalese, then they understand it according to a different form. And you can, of course, simply say, well, you're wrong, and therefore your original meaning doesn't count, but that creates a larger problem about what you mean by popular sovereignty and original meaning. Now, this turns out to be a live controversy at the time of the founding. This is what Saul Cornell's work is about, in which he says there are contrasting debates about whose version of original meaning was going to be relevant. Was it going to be the lawyer's original meaning, or is it going to be the meaning of the ordinary citizen who read the text? And this stumbling problem, that is, how do I know it's really a term of art, is just a small version of that larger debate.
And if I could tag off that, actually, the place where the translation most goes awry is when Lambertus Durand tries to paraphrase terms of art. But in many other places where he clearly recognizes a term of art that has no Dutch equivalent, he invents cognates that are comical, right? Corruptie van blood, ex post facto wet, Bill van Attainder, right? Like,
Is he related to Jim Van de Tander? That's his brother.
And so one might say that the places where he most goes off the rails are when he fails to recognize that this is a concept that does not have a map in that he is aware of or that he understands correctly. Whereas the German gets closer much more of the time, but he paraphrases much more often. So for naturalization, he says granting of a citizen's right. Bill of Attainder and ex post facto law is no law that declares someone guilty without court decision or that will be made after the deed has been committed and declares someone guilty shall be made. Corruption of blood, no law, no punishment shall extend to his relatives. So he gets closer because he gets it, and that's I think is interesting.
Right, and now we have Will Bode, Chris Green, and Brian Wildenfeld.
Curious for your general reaction to sort of how good or bad the translations are, because I think you do disclaim a lot of problems in them, but also point out a lot of things that are good about them. So I'm just kind of curious how good or bad you think they are, and in particular, I wonder if there's an implication we could draw either way. So a kind of happy story would be something like, well, there are some things in the translations that are kind of comical, but really the important thing is they're remarkably good. They get like a lot of it right, despite the fact that these guys say they don't speak the language very well and don't even know any law. And so all the people who fret and worry that we can't really figure out the original meaning of the Constitution, just further evidence that actually most of it's not rocket science, and and 99% of the Constitution is kind of easy cases. The sad story would be something more like, but look at how many mistakes there are, and apparently sort of how much indifference there was to the generation of these translations. You would expect if the people in charge of commissioning them or really cared about the views of the people in Pennsylvania, really cared about popular acceptance, really cared about the text, they would have hired a couple of translators and checked their work against one another, or demanded to see it, or done something about the things in it that are obviously wrong. And so this shows that even then there was sort of depressing indifference to popular sovereignty or text or anything like that. And I'm wondering if you accept either or both of those narratives.
So one point was to kind of push to see you back up the crazy train, and I think I'm not sure I'm understanding quite Jack's point, but I think I want to push back against one of his initial comments. So Jack was arguing that, well, if there's a choice about what translation, there's just ambiguity. Historical research can't resolve that ambiguity. That doesn't seem right, because it's possible that the translator didn't know enough about the context to resolve the ambiguity. I mean, resolving ambiguity is knowing more about the context. And just in general, what we're looking for is the hypothetical, fully informed member of the public. The actual members of the public are only relevant insofar as they tell us, and they usually tell us an awful lot, about what a hypothetical fully informed, i.e. like knowing their Blackstone, knowing all their stuff. One really technical, just specific thing I'm curious about, I've been fussing over Article 4, and in the Dutch translation, at the end of the comedy clause, so privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states, it almost sounds, so I'm curious if anybody knows Dutch, what the word onderscheidene. So it sounds to me a little like other states. So the citizens of each state shall have the privileges and immunities of citizens in other states. Is that right? In that case, it would be a really, really strong textual pointer to comedy. David Upham has a similar, he pointed out that in some of the treaty evidence about the privileges and immunities of citizens, or rights, advantages, and immunities of citizens of the United States. I think either the Guadalupe Hidalgo or the Florida session, one of them says the privileges and immunities of citizens of the other states, suggesting that it's not a federal thing. It's like the privileges of the state level citizenship. So that particular, the several states, the United States, the other states. That it strikes me as a really fruitful area to look at with just, look at the French, look at the Spanish. I'm very curious to look at all this.
Yeah, it's a magnificent paper. I'm envious if you hit upon a treasure trove of just fascinating historical material. And I guess my main thoughts were that what I took away from it on some of these specific clauses is it seems like they're, tentatively, there might be some mild evidence pointing to the idea that constitutional language was understood in more of an ordinary sense, and kind of in pushing against the tendency of some commentators and scholars to view language like privileges and immunities as highly specialized terms of art. So that's the one I'm familiar with. It's like Chris, was 14th Amendment, Article 4, is what I've happened to be buried in. And there's a long tradition of viewing the PI clause as highly abstruse and technical, and it doesn't just mean any old privileges and immunities. And so, and yet there's been increasing evidence that other scholars that it really does just mean, roughly, freedoms, rights, freedoms, liberties, and an immunity does mean you're immune from something. It means it can't harm you or affect you, and that's the same as being free. You're free from, I'm immune from disease, I'm free from disease. So they could be thought to mean the same thing. And this evidence, pleases me in a sense because, it seems to kind of push in that direction. Other people have pretty covered most of what I was going to say. I think obviously there's two different ways in which this is significant for original meaning. And my view is, it's kind of fun to think about the issue of the significance of this in terms of a third of Pennsylvanians relying on it. I don't think really there's ultimately a lot of traction there because although, the people voted for these conventions, I think it's pretty clear, I would assume that every member of the ratifying convention was fluent in English, and they voted for it, and that was the formal legal authoritative act. And so I don't think Pennsylvania can kind of claim more rights, or that you can kind of say the German version's authoritative, because that might have been a problem. It's unfortunate. Maybe a third of Pennsylvanians only spoke German. They were misled by the translation, and so something went wrong there. But, you know, a lot of people were disenfranchised at this time. It's just, if you start getting into what percentage of the people weren't adequately informed, then you just got you're radically undermining and questioning the legitimacy of the whole thing. So we kind of have to go with the idea that unless the ratifying conventions were seriously misled, then this doesn't affect it. But the real significance, I agree with all the others, so I'll just echo that what is really fascinating here is this is just kind of a direct window into what a presumably typical person, how they read the Constitution. And it has unique value because, as you note very well, this is one of the only types of such evidence that's kind of an even window into the entire Constitution. It doesn't just single out certain phrases that are of peculiar interest, but you get the whole thing with some glitches and problems. And that's incredibly valuable. I mean, so often when I've studied original sources around the 14th Amendment, I just wish, would somebody please have written something where they just kind of went through every phrase and clause and said, yeah, this is what we think it meant. You know, they weren't blogging enough back then, and so we just don't know what they meant. And so this is great because the work of translation forces the person, even on the boring parts, to go through and come up with some impression of what it means. Now, could it be kind of thin and minimal, but it's something, and it's a lot more. I think it really does add. I think it is a very significant addition. Yeah, it's one drop in the broader ocean, but I think we are starved for additional evidence of what ordinary people thought these words meant, and so this is great.
Thank you. So all I can say to you, Brian, is I basically agree. Great. Well, so the challenge with writing this is that the translations are actually pretty good, but sometimes good enough that there's very little to say about them. So if you go through the very extensive appendix, there's a lot of times where it's like, that's rough. Yep, that's roughly what it means. And so in that sense, they are pretty good. There are plenty of places where there are the opportunity to insert mistakes. In fact, 3. So one is the translator's failure to understand the English. Second is their failure to be able to express their understanding in the translation. And then we have a third problem, which is that we are trying to explain to you in English what they meant in German. And so I think it's just abundantly possible that, you know, this is not a perfect endeavor. But you know, they're pretty good. They really are. Chris, so what I find really interesting about your question, which I was starting to think about a couple days ago, is that if we don't count these 2 translators as good enough members of the public, then I wonder if this reduces the idea of original public meaning to some kind of reasonable man who lived in that time period, where this person's a construct that no person was or could have been, which your thumbs up sounds like you agree with. But, you know, I wonder if the more dominant view is that the original public meaning, or maybe this is more contested than I thought, is the meaning that real people thought it had. Whether those real people are the lawyers who had a reasonable amount of context, or just anybody who was reasonably well educated enough to form an intelligent opinion. And so I'm not sure if I want to say that these people can't count, because there are probably very few people, even though this was really slapdash in a lot of ways, that was done quickly, there are mistakes, there are probably not too many other people that gave as much thought and consideration to the meaning of the Constitution than these 2 translators. And so I worry that if these people don't count, that it's an entirely theoretical endeavor divorced from reality and real people.
I wanted to follow up on this point. It reminds me of a very famous story. I mean, one way of what Chris is trying to do is Chris is trying to remove as much as possible, the possibility of latent ambiguity at the time of adoption. If you have a fully informed reasonable person, then that person will have no latent ambiguities because they will be fully informed and they will be reasonable. Now, the problem is we've never met such a person. It's not clear that such a person exists. If so, it's not clear that they were present at the time to adopt the Constitution, and so the connection between popular sovereignty and them is problematic. But it does raise this puzzle, which is even if you had informed people, fairly well-informed, not perfect people, fairly informed, could there be latent ambiguities in the text? And this reminds me of a very famous Talmudic story, which appears in the tractate Megillah. It's the story about the translation of the Septuagint. The Septuagint was the standard Greek translation of the scripture for many years, and the story goes that Ptolemy, was a Greek king, summoned 72 scholars, rabbis, and Septuagint means 70, not 72, but, we round around in Jewish theology. Anyway, he summoned 72 of them, and he said to each of them, I'm going to lock you in a room, and here is the Torah, and please translate it into Greek for me. And he doesn't tell them about the existence of any of the other 72. And he locks them in the room, and I guess he feeds them, and they come out and they produce the 72 translations of the Torah, and lo and behold, as the story goes in the Talmud, they were all identical. Right? It was magic. It was the Spirit of God in them, so that the text was identical. So the story of the Septuagint is really what Chris wants for the Constitution, that he wants there to be the hand of God in it, so that there was a divine inspiration, and there is only one reasonable meaning. There is no latent ambiguity. The problem, of course, is this is a legend in the Talmud. It's not how actual politics works. And so we have to make a decision. This is another way of understanding Chris's point, is what are we demanding of meaning? How much can we demand of meaning for a theory of popular sovereignty? I tend to be more forgiving in the way that ordinary people work, and therefore I believe in the possibility of latent ambiguities. But believe me, your mileage may differ.
I mean, that's not the way we got the King James Bible? Shocked. Okay.
Well, that's the famous saying, if English was good enough for Jesus Christ, it's good enough for me.
Absolutely.
There you are.
A true statement by a Texas college.
That's right.
Now, Bob Bennett, Steve Sachs, and Larry Alexander.
Working on, particularly interested in ambiguity, and I may just have misunderstood something Jack said, so I wanted to get some clarification. I thought that, this was in your initial remarks, I thought you said that a translation can reveal a latent ambiguity. I can certainly understand how two translations could reveal a latent ambiguity if they go in different directions. And I guess I can understand how one translation, if the person who's reading it and trying to derive something from it had one idea about what something meant, and the translation goes in a different direction, could become sensitive to latent ambiguity on account of that translation. But absent those two possibilities, I don't see how, and maybe I just misunderstood you, a translation can reveal latent ambiguity.
I have three quick points. First, you may have mentioned this, but were there any contemporary newspapers, whether in Europe or Mexico or the Caribbean, or other people who published their translations of the Constitution? Do we know anything about this? I would think that somewhere in the French or German or Dutch press, somebody would have said something about it, and maybe included a copy, but who knows? I don't know if that ground has been plowed. The second thing, on Richard's point about linguistic primacy, there are plenty of people today who do not speak English and yet vote. And we have presumably some political theory about what their participation means. Presumably they are relying on their sources of evidence as to what Congress has enacted when they're voting for representatives, but we would have presumably the same answer would apply. Finally, one thing I think is really interesting is that, of course, we naturally assume that we are dealing here with 18th century German and Dutch. The move to read it in modern German and Dutch would seem quite strange. And one could say the same of trying to read the Constitution in modern English. I think that one thing that highlights, and it would be even better if they'd written the Constitution in law French, because then we would really know that what's going on here is a specialized language that needs to be translated for it to have a legal effect. Whereas we might have the misimpression that we can actually directly access it just by knowing English well enough.
What was the thing that you said in law French?
So law French was the language that after they no longer wrote statutes in Latin, they wrote them in this bastard amalgam of Latin, French, English, and whatever else they could think of. And so you get these weird case reports in the yearbooks that say like, le defendant a thrown le brickbat à le judge. And like, and, you know, you just get this terrible stuff where they're sort of mixing all sorts of words together. Yeah. So if they'd written the Constitution, what was quite obviously a different legal language all the way down, then we might understand that it requires a little more parsing.
Yeah, this is a really nice paper, and one of the things that's revealed is that, and I think this is the point here, is that public meaning, leaving aside for a moment Chris's highly idealized version, was not univocal. Now, whether there's now that's not exactly revealed just by having these translations. It would be interesting if the German translation translated into Dutch matched the Dutch translation and vice versa, then you would say, well, there's no ambiguity that's being revealed there, because. But notice that we have translations of English into English because that's just the paraphrasing, right? When courts interpret statutes, you know, in the opinion, what they'll do is they'll take the language of the statute and then they'll paraphrase it as this is, and it's the competition between the parties is over which paraphrase to pick. But so Chris wants to push for the sort of idealized, fully informed. So we get rid of these different public understandings, which could be the Dutch versus the German versus the English versus different parts of the English-speaking population and so forth. We get rid of this by the idealized, fully informed reader. Fully informed about what? I mean, so now, of course, I have a dogma in this fight, which is that fully informed about what the intended meaning was. That's what you would be fully informed about. Otherwise, you just have different meanings there. One of the interesting things is the public meaning move is largely response to the worry about aggregation and trying to find a univocal solution. What this reveals to some extent is there is no univocal relation. In fact, there could be a univocal intended meaning and multiple public meanings. So it's an extremely interesting way to get at that particular point.
I think that's right. Anna could not have said it better.
And I think this actually answers your question.
Yeah. The way you get ambiguity is just by looking at any set of sources, right? And they go in different directions, and so you see that different people in that time period had different. But so we have the translations, and we also have the Federalist Papers.
Unless you can disagree with yourself. If you can disagree with yourself, then you don't need to. But if you have at least two, yes, that's fine.
We've got one trio left, by the way. Let's try to get through it. But go ahead. We'll finish.
No, we'll go to the next one. That was all brilliant.
Okay, our final trio are. Oh, did you want to say any more?
No, that was good.
Good. So Kurt Lash, Randy Kozel, Michael McConnell.
Yeah, I loved the paper. It's wonderfully destabilizing. It can create a tremor through the force, thinking that there are these translations out there that'll upset everything. But a quick comment to Jack's point about latent ambiguity. I think if what you're really talking about is a situation where the meaning itself is ambiguous, that there are competing, inconsistent meanings available in the text itself, and no history is going to resolve it, then I think that's maybe what Larry would call a communicative failure. In other words, nothing has been communicated, and therefore it has no legal application. I mean, because there's no speaking. right? So at least I'm not really sure that would open the door to construction. That's all. So that's something that I'd want to grapple with. As far as the translation issues are concerned, I, like everybody else here, I'm interested in learning more. What other translations are available? I think that they're all relevant to getting a larger N for patterns of usage, right? Some will be more relevant and some will be better than others, but it's still going to increase the N. I think that's why everybody here is going to be interested. But it also makes me think about other available translations that we haven't been spending a lot of time on. Some of them Randy has pointed out in the past, Roger Sherman's translation, for example, of the Bill of Rights. And then translations like these. Here's a translation of the Constitution at the time. That every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by the said Constitution clearly delegated to the Congress of the United States or the departments of government thereof, remains to the people of the several states, or to their respective state governments to whom they may have granted the same. That's the New York Convention's translation of the Constitution, right? It is a translation. It's translation by competent English speakers, grappling with the Constitution and its meaning. So I think we have available translations. You've pointed out that this can be very helpful to establishing original meaning, and it's just to the extent that I think that your work on translations are important, I think it also suggests that these other translations are also important, that they've maybe also been wrongly ignored.
Just a really little suggestion, going to something you said on the point of whether translation of one of the key terms might show ambiguity versus just translators' misunderstanding. So you said, I don't think the translator, I'm not sure the translator could make a mistake. And I'm not sure you need to go that far, and I don't think your paper necessarily goes that far. I think what you're saying is more guarded and more defensible. I think what you're saying is, assuming an adequate level of competency and expertise, I don't think these translators made a mistake. And that walks you into sort of an interesting issue that you can keep developing, I think. It's almost the flip side of Randy's question about ideal translator, but who's the minimum adequate translator? And do we determine that ex ante or do we determine an ex post, right? We could determine an ex ante by saying, here are sufficient criteria of this person, and then I will rely on what they say, and absent the egregious mistakes, I'll assume what they're doing is illuminating ambiguity. Or you could say, I'm just going to do it ex post, and if they got it mostly right, I'm going to impute to them sufficient competency to take seriously the stuff they didn't get obviously wrong. But I think that's something you start to do in the paper, and it would be neat to think more about that, sort of why these translators satisfy your bar, and whether any translators might not.
Like Steve Sachs, I was wondering about other translations. There must have been translations in Europe. We know that the Constitution was being followed in Europe. We know, for example, that American bonds greatly increased in value in the Amsterdam market upon the first reading of the Constitution. So I'm guessing there must have been translations. But when I think about translations in Europe versus translations in Pennsylvania and New York, it just raises some interesting theoretical questions about why we care. Because maybe we care because we think that language is ambiguous. I think this was Jack's initial point. Or maybe we care because this is a window into what a third of the population of Pennsylvania might well have thought. I think those are entirely different theories for why we might care. It even bears upon whether we care how good the translations are, because under the first theory we do care, but under the second theory, even if the translation's terrible, actually, especially if it's terrible, it makes it very interesting if we think a third of the population of the second largest state, ratified on the basis of a misunderstanding. So I think the concept of these European translations that must exist help illuminate the kind of theory underneath the paper.
And I think I can respond to both you and Kurt at the same time in a way, right? Just so we can care for both reasons, both that the language is ambiguous and that it's a window into what the readers of it thought or what the translators thought. And I think that's just because language is ambiguous doesn't mean we have to be radical postmodernists where we can't tell exactly what it means and so it means nothing. I think that's wrong, right? There's still boundaries of plausible interpretations that, can get mapped out accurately that we can mostly all agree on. And so it is useful to show that the original public meaning may have been a variety of meanings. And at the same time, it is important to know what those were because they can still cast out other options as being off the table, right? And that's a good place to end.
Well, it's a nice segue to dinner time then. Thank you.